Hi, everyone. Welcome to Upstream Day. I hope you all are enjoying the conversations and ideas that are flowing around. I'm excited to get to spend a little bit of time with y'all over the next bit, looking at some things that we've learned over the past few years around what open source maintainers are thinking about with all of the standards and incentives and things that are moving quite quickly these days in the application security space. I'm Lauren Hanford. I'm the VP of Product here at Tidelift, and let's get going. So just to level set here a little bit, the foundation for this talk is a report that we're getting ready to release called the Tidelift Open Source Maintainer Impact Report. And this report is going to be looking at some things that we've done within Tidelift related to standards and outcomes over a specific period of time. And then we're going to hone in closer, both in the report and in this talk, on what we've seen as we focused on a set of OpenSSF scorecard checks and what were the outcomes that we saw. So this is not going to be a Tidelift sales pitch, but I am going to talk a lot about the experience here at Tidelift. So I'm really confident and hopeful that we'll be able to show you some exciting news about a unique way that we can address some of the supply chain challenges that we see in software today, and what it looks like when a set of maintainers do want to opt in to a software supply chain where it's not quite so accidental, as is the theme of our talk today. All right, so the moment that we find ourselves in today is a complex systemic problem, right? Anybody who's here at this conference likely understands this, but just to put it in, some succinct bullet points here, we know that from data that we've done, which I'll get into, that open source maintainers are feeling stressed. We know that there are tools that are creating a lot of noise, and it can be hard to discern signal from noise. It can also be hard to discern signal from noise, even when it comes to the growing body of standards that are coming into the field of vision for maintainers. We also know that complying with these standards or doing the work to do well on those standards is additional effort that is unpaid in addition to the development and maintenance work that they're already doing. And it can be unclear if and when these security practices are actually going to make a real difference. Is it security theater? Is it going to make a material difference? Is the return on their time there? I think, alongside that, we have producers in industry who are creating software. They too are stressed. They too are using tools in some cases that can also create too much noise, and it can be hard to find out what matters to focus on. I think for these software producers in industry, there's a lack of predictability. Open source is something that they're very reliant on, but they don't have a lot of control over. And so that lack of predictability can be hard. Then on top of that, we've got the overlay of the United States government executive order, cybersecurity strategy, and other regulatory effects that are coming. And that's going to create a new era of accountability for these software producers. They're going to have to know and understand what's happening in the open source they rely on in a way that they haven't had to before. And then we have our downstream consumers who are also in this system. And these are the folks for whom real supply chain attacks can have far-reaching ramifications. This is a photo of not my actual dentist, but my actual dentist, Dr. Hobbs, is a small business owner, and her data was actually hacked in the Equifax hack many years ago. And as a result of that, she's actually had to shift her entire business practices. As a small business owner, she can't leverage credit in the same way that she used to. She has to run her inbound, outbound income streams and the way that she gets supplies to do her job entirely differently now as a result of that. It's super frustrating for her. And so I think it's important to remember that there are real people across all of these different buckets of folks. So when we look at, again, the moment that we're in here with this really intensive government attention on what's happening, I think that we are at the beginning of an exciting time of real change. I do think that this is actually starts with a very obvious thing, which is having a real relationship with upstream maintainers. And I think that is the sort of crux of our theme of the conference is, what does it look like when something isn't an accidental supply chain? How do we ensure that we're taking care of things in the right way and that we can, we understand what we're doing and we can attest to it. So a lot of the things that have been laid out in the secure software development framework that NIST has put out are things that actually Tidelift has been doing for a while now with maintainers. So I'm excited to get more into that with y'all here. So we are going to deep dive on the maintainers in this talk. The name of the conference is Upstream. I'll save the talk about my dentist for another day. Anyway, so we've done a recent survey with open source maintainers. It's the second time we've done this. And the data that we got back on this is quite interesting. So there's a comparison here between what we learned in 2021 and what we learned in 2023. Moving to the top of the list now is a number one reason that maintainers things they dislike about being an open source maintainer is that it's adding to personal stress. Number two, also moved up, not being financially compensated. Number three, moving up can be lonely. And then a new entry point, being asked to comply with requirements that I don't have time for. So we also see in this data that we have pretty low percentages of awareness overall. Again, there's overwhelm with the number of standards that are emerging. There's some skepticism about the validity or the value of what's in these standards. Maintainers are really curious people by and large. They want to understand the why behind the what. They also have to be very attentive to that return on investment for their time to go deeper into these kinds of things because their time is so limited. They're not, by and large, they're not being paid professionally as a full-time job to work on this stuff. So it can be really challenging to figure out, where would I fit this in? Why would I fit this in? What's the return on my time? So this is a deeper chart that's looking at a few of the top kind of security and maintenance practices. And even in and amongst these kinds of things, we also see low adoption. So the purple graph here is folks that are professional and semi-professional, so they're receiving some level of income for working on their open source project. And the gray bars are folks that are unpaid. And so the purple progress that we see here are people that are either implementing some of these practices or they are planning to implement these practices. And the gap, when we aggregate this across this and a few other buckets, is overall we see that paid maintainers are 25 to 30% more likely to be doing this work or be planning to do this work compared to unpaid maintainers. So that's troubling, right? When we think about not only where we are today, but where we are ahead, this is frankly not going to be enough adoption to secure our software supply chain. And I was reminded in another Upstream talk that we recorded previously with a maintainer that some of the things on this checklist, it's not as obvious when you're looking at it as a checklist, but there is a lot of underlying work here that a maintainer is signing up for as a result. So the example that we talked about was, even just having a disclosure plan available about how to be contacted about security research or security vulnerabilities. You have to have a whole set of practices underpinning that of what are you going to do in the instance that someone delivers this news to you? Are you going to have the time to work on it? And so, even reducing this to something that looks, it's a few items, it looks, straightforward, is more complicated than it can look on the surface. So finally, I wanted to share this key recommendations from a report that went to the Office of the President, the White House. This is actually from November 2021, although this group, NSTAC, is doing more and more investigation into these things. So they're looking at, how are we going to help industry? How are we going to help the government solve some of these challenges around software assurances? And a key finding in this report is that open source is not inherently less secure than closed source software, but the incentives aren't there, right? There's no paycheck, there's no DevOps and compliance team and security teams sitting around these application maintainers. And that's not an effective way to do this, and it's not sufficient. So some of the key recommendations, there were a bunch in the report, but two I wanted to call out for this talk were, incentivizing collaboration between open source developers, aka maintainers, and organizations focusing on security, such as the OpenSSF. And then they go a little bit deeper into that and say, we want to encourage maintainers to adopt a system of code vetting, such as OpenSSF scorecard. So a set of checks that were established to drive clarity and improvement of security practices for open source. So I have great news for you all, and that is Tidelift has a model to do this, right? So we've been evolving security standards, secure package standards since 2018. The model that we run here is we pay maintainers to hold their packages to this set of standards. We measure and guide their effort, and in return for that, they get paid a reliable income, monthly income. As part of this process, there are things that they do and there are things that they attest to. And the data that comes from that, we can use to drive visibility and better decision-making for paying customers. And so this allows us to create this value loop of maintainers having reliable income to do the secure development practices work. And then the folks that are paying us are able to get that data to drive their own clarity, decision-making, and they are prepared for the attestation moment that we find ourselves in. And we've seen a lot of continued sustained interest over these 5+ years of doing this work. We have many maintainers who are continuing to show up and say, I need reliable income to do my work. So what do we see with that investment? This is a slice of some of the secure development practices that are a part of our contract with partnered maintainers. So our task completion data, as anything is ever evolving, but this is a snapshot in time of compliance with the standards that our partnered maintainers were at. So you can sort of think of Tidelift as a central IT or compliance office for upstream open source packages. Our job is to let folks know where there may be a gap. Our job is to ensure that they're paid and that they have the clarity to do the work. And then, as you can see here, maintainers are delivering. So what else do we see with that investment? Well, to no one's surprise, maintainers are very tuned in to what their projects or ecosystems need to be more secure as well. They're going far beyond what we're doing in our set of standards with the individual work that they may be doing. So the list, very long list that you're seeing here today, comes from a Seth Larson blog, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. And these are just activities that are happening on URLlib3 in the Python ecosystem. So Tidelift is not the only income stream for URLlib3, but it is a critical one, and it has been quite reliable for this team to be able to do all of these things that you see here. They're thinking about security from the end to end, right? They want to add a secondary paid maintainer in order to protect against that bust factor. They're continuously improving their release practices and their release pipeline. They're being mindful about what downstream consumers need to have in hand to feel really confident about the open source they're using. They're also able to create plans for providing security fixes on those older releases, which I think is just such a wonderful attunement to, again, what those downstream consumers need to have. Also scoring really highly on the OpenSSF scorecard, which again, we'll get into deeper in this talk. Engaging with the OpenSSF best practices badge, putting that up on the project, amplifying out to other folks in open source that this work is happening. And then literally creating materials for other maintainers to secure their accounts and projects. They've created a secure Python project template that includes everything to get started with OpenSSF scorecards and Salsa as well, which is pretty awesome. And the way the Tidelift model works, all of these improvements are available to everyone that uses URLlib3. So, all right, so that's kind of the lay of the land of Tidelift's model and the backstory here. So then we want to go into what happens when we review OpenSSF scores specifically and put some attention on that. So we started with a focus cohort of 26 open source maintainers and 26 packages. And where we started with that, timestamp of September 2021, which is when the scorecard started making the scoring data publicly available, We were about even, right? We had a focused cohort, and then we had the sort of average score of all SS packages. This is an average score, focused cohort, average score of all SS packages. So we began the actual focused time. It was in May to June timeframe of 2022, so about a year ago. We didn't have every single piece of the cohort start at the exact same time. But in this time range, this is what we see in terms of difference between the average score of our focus cohort and the average score of all SS packages. So it wasn't surprising to us that the scores for folks in our cohort was already elevated. A lot of the measurements of the scorecard are reflected in those standards that we, again, pay partnered maintainers to uphold. And by and large, we find that our partnered maintainers are generally paying a little bit closer attention as things like this come into the landscape. So then we get to the results over the course of the year of looking, again, having this really focused time on the scorecard. And so where we find ourselves in May of 2023 is that the focus cohort average score is 7.2, and then the all SS packages score is 3.3. So I think what's really significant about this is when you look at the fact that the Tidelift model overall was able to drive improvement in scores 57% from the time we are able to first start measuring that data. This is a classic up and to the right kind of chart that you want to see. We'll get into some of the opportunities to improve, what are the different scores or how things might be measured. But in general, I think it's really significant to see this pattern that our average cohort package score, if an SSF score, is going up and to the right and is so high. And again, when we compare this to folks that were not in the cohort, I mean, this is just the breadth of open source, it's pretty significant. So we want to get into, what are some of the details, right? So what did we do to achieve this kind of result? So for us, our mission here is to have all of these things, right? We want to drive community and conversations, and we want to deliver the right incentives to have this kind of work done. You can see here that there was an average of 12 cross ecosystems interaction per discussion. Each one of these bars is a discussion on how to complete work for scorecard checks. This is not because the scorecard is necessarily cumbersome or that maintainers don't know how to do something, but there's a lot of nuance when you get into things. There's nuance across ecosystems, there's nuance across types of packages. Maintainers have different approaches of how they think about things and how, the sort of mental policies that they have for how they run their packages. And so it was really exciting to be able to witness all of these folks, talking back and forth across the way things that were done in Python versus Java versus JavaScript and other ecosystems, and really see that impact. It wasn't something that we measured in this data study, but you saw that there was enough interaction there where it did begin to feel less lonely, right? Which was another thing that maintainers struggle with. And then we see here that most maintainers in this cohort found that the financial incentives were neutral or better with the additional workload that we were requiring to participate, which is good signal, right? We're on a good track when we are able to see that. One quote from our study here was from a partnered maintainer was, "Security is something that's usually hard to prioritize. Clear suggestions of what to do paired with funding to go and do it is the ideal combination to make things happen." So as I noted earlier, maintainers are going to maintain. They're going to go out and just knock it out of the park. So, we see this force multiplier effect, the scaling effect, right? As I mentioned earlier, we have delivered out of this a secure Python project template for Python packages. Seth also developed a recurring view of Python scores over time to increase visibility and adoption of the scorecard. We also had a maintainer, put forward the idea of, could Apache create access to a dedicated GitHub action for all of those Apache projects to be able to adopt the scorecard? Again, raising that visibility, raising that adoption. And then the last two items on here were things that Java maintainers were able to do when they went through the process of getting their scores elevated on certain checks. They saw opportunity to improve ecosystem tooling or ecosystem measurement where they could take the lessons they learned and push those out to other maintainers as they adopt scorecards on their project. So it's just really, it was really fun and exciting to see maintainers engage with what the scorecards checks were measuring, look to make those things better, not only on the scorecard side, but also within their ecosystems as well. So just to give you a sense of scale here too. So again, our pilot cohort here was 26 maintainers, 26 packages. So of those 26 maintainers, there are actually over 2,500 packages that those folks maintain or contribute to. So what's exciting about that is 70% of those folks reported that they have implemented the scorecard checks on other projects during this paid pilot. So they weren't being paid to implement the practices on other projects, but once they had the right incentive in place to start to explore the checks and apply them to a single package, it made sense to them to then apply it to other things that they work on. The maintainers also went further in what we asked them to do during this time. So originally we had scoped this to 5 checks. They also deeply engaged with us on 8 additional checks out of the 19 checks total at that time. So results. Maintainers are willing to improve both the measurement of things and the outcomes that those things deliver. So maintainers were making contributions and they were improving scorecards, which is, again, a recommendation on how we're going to address some of our software supply chain challenges. So as I mentioned earlier, the scorecard as implemented today doesn't allow for enough nuance to assess meaningful security practices and most importantly, outcomes across all types of ecosystems, all types of packages. But maintainers are seeing value in it, and they were eager to participate in making it even better. You see a couple of quotes here, monetary incentive is important, the metrics need refinement. After all, the goal is maximum security, not just getting and displaying a good mark, right? Which is great. This is the kind of mindset and engagement that we really wanted to cultivate in this effort. Some of the checks are obvious, were already fulfilled, or we complied right away. It made sense, it was clear. Others may not apply, or they may generate a lot of false positives for little benefit. So again, there's this trade-offs moment that happens. I mean, very similar to how software would be built anywhere. There's always a series of trade-offs that are happening. Another quote from a maintainer in the cohort is, there's value here, both in making the current status visible and in teaching other maintainers. It is mostly a matter of bandwidth, since as a maintainer, there are also so many other things to do. So what's next? We are continuing to listen and learn and adapt and scale the work that we're doing. We can say definitively that as a result of this work, packages are being developed with more security practices in place. And we see that the software supply chain security is increasing. We want to continue developing better security solutions for single maintainer packages. The majority of open source packages are going to have a single maintainer. And so that makes it hard to do things like code review. We want to figure out ways to work on that at scale with our partnered maintainers. There was a lot of feedback on looking at dependency management and dependency checking, where there's, again, just this wave of noise that's coming in, and how do you deal with the different kinds of false positives? Again, this is a problem that industry is facing as well. So we want to continue to work closely with the maintainers that we partner with and figure out how to continue to improve that for them. We want to continue to contribute to the scorecards project. We want to be a partner there to improve scoring, to learn from the scorecards team, to have our voices shared, and certainly to amplify maintainer voices and ensure that they are being centered in all of this. We also want to go further with understanding, measuring, and strengthening maintainer build practices. This is something that, again, is coming up quite a bit in the NIST Secure Software Development Framework that's been put forward. And so we want to use this unique relationship that we have to be able to understand directly from the maintainers how they're doing things, how often they're changing things, and what are the supports they need in place to be able to do that more and more securely. And then finally, we want to work with maintainers to understand and scale the security practices that they have in place that aren't being measured by the current scorecard or other industry checks. So this shows up in both the contributing back to the scorecards project, but then also looking at what industry is expected to attest to. What can we provide as extra enhancement to that data? Where maintainers are doing some pretty awesome things to secure their projects, and want to continue highlighting that. So wanted to put this quote up here from Jordan Harband, JavaScript maintainer, that without this model, he wouldn't be able to put the care into the attention into this critical work without being paid for it. So it is important work. Maintainers are counting on us to amplify the real cost and the real value of this work. And so that's our job here, is to continue doing that. We're going to continue scaling, the maintainer relationships that we have across these ecosystems here and others. There are a lot of packages that score highly on criticality scores that have a vendor standing behind them. So we really want to continue to find those dependency graphs where independent maintainers are just out there and they need support, they need partnership, and they certainly need reliable income to meet this growing wave of accountability. And again, for the folks that have decided to opt in and say, I am okay being a part of a supply chain, I accept that responsibility. It's important that we meet them there with incentives and clarity and community. Okay, so this is our final slide here. The thought to leave you with is, that improving security outcomes for the software supply chain, and in particular in open source, is going to be a networked, people-centered problem. So, we want to create this world where secure practices are the default, because again, any maintainer who accepts being a part of that, who wants to opt into it, they've got what they need. They've got the time they need, they've got incentives, and they have clarity. This last graph on here was asking this cohort, how likely would you be to continue checking on and improving your scorecard score if there were no incentives in place? So we can see here, 55% said, neutral to very unlikely, right? This is pretty clear. Maintainers are telling us that this security work must be incentivized. Thank you all so much for your time, and I hope that you go thank a maintainer today. They're doing a lot.